Hey, what's up? This is Commishenanigans here for part 2 of the foam and plaster tutorial, and I'm just going to be going over plaster this time. If you missed the foam part, just go check out part 1. So, what you'll be needing for this one is plaster and some water to mix it with. But mostly what you need is plaster with a 20 to 30 minute set time. And you can use casting plaster or pottery plaster, whatever you can get basically. Plaster of Paris is essentially name brand plaster. It's usually sold in bulk, so you want to try and get the smallest amount possible because you don't actually need all that much. But whatever extra you've got, just put it in an airtight container and that way it'll last longer and you might be able to use it for some other props later. So mixing up your plaster. What I use is called the dry island technique as far as I know. And what you do is you fill up your mixing container about halfway with water and you're just leaving enough room for the plaster. And since it's about a 50-50 mix, half is, pretty good bet. Less maybe if you're worried about spilling stuff. And then you pour the plaster in slowly, letting it settle between each pour. And when the plaster leaves a small dry island at the center of your bowl, you've got enough plaster and you can mix it up the rest of the way. Let it settle for a second before you mix it and then just, get it so that there's no clumps or anything like that. And you want it to be fairly thick, kind of a yogurt consistency, which is fairly appropriate given my mixing container, and then just scoop it out onto your piece and smooth it down. You want it to be a fairly thin coat, just enough to fill in all the holes and bubbles and anything like that, because light as plaster is, the weight does build up pretty quickly if you let it get thick, so just, try to avoid that. And pour the plaster into any corners or big gaps you've got, and then smooth it down, and that'll just ensure that you get all your details and everything like that. So as the plaster sets, you can do some final smoothing using your palm as a sort of sandpaper, and that'll just get out any extra lumps and make your job easier later on. It'll just save you some time later. And plaster also sticks to itself pretty well, especially if you move on before it's fully gone through its exothermic stage, which is the stage where it gets warm and hardens. So you can fill in any dents and things that you don't like without having to worry about the plaster separating from itself or something like that. If you have waited a while, you should dampen the plaster a bit before you add any more, because set plaster sucks the moisture out of fresh plaster unbelievably quickly. It's just impossible to work with. The real problem is actually building it up too quickly if you've got dry plaster that you're adding fresh plaster to. But just, work with it, smooth down the edges, and blend the new plaster into the old plaster, and then just keep doing that. Work in small batches because you've got a pretty limited work time, and the more detailed your piece is, the smaller batches you should work in, because, like I mentioned, limited work time, you don't want to be halfway through some details and then have your plaster set up on you and ruin everything. Large, smooth pieces, you can actually do them pretty quickly. I try to do just one set for the horns, because even though they're bigger, they're kind of a lot faster to do, and it's way easier to just try and coat it all at once than try and go back in when you've got a smooth surface. But even though the helmet is smaller, it's much more complicated, so I like to work slowly and make sure I get all the details. And also, as the plaster starts to set, it becomes almost sculptable, and it's not something that you want to use a lot of, but it does let you fill in any gaps that you're not pleased with, any areas that you're like, about, just lets you bulk those out. Oh, and an important note, once the plaster starts to heat up, you should try to avoid doing much more than just smoothing it out. If you do try to work with it, it'll start flaking and breaking up, gets kind of crumbly, and it won't hold together as a finished product. So unless it's essential, just stop touching it. And also, you want to clean your mixing bowl between each batch. If you use a soft plastic container, flexing the sides breaks the plaster off of them, and then you can just rinse it out before you start your next mix. Once you've finished coating your piece with plaster, now you can move on to surfacing your piece. And if you've got huge amounts of plaster built up, you can go in with a clay tool and scrape some of it off. You want to do that step when the plaster is still pretty wet, fully set but not completely dried out. It's not something I really recommend because it's kind of an aggressive way to remove the plaster, and it sometimes pulls the plaster straight off the foam, but it does take it down more quickly than sandpaper, so if you've got a bunch of buildup, it's probably the way to go. And then, once you've got that, you can move on to sanding it. For this, you actually want to wait until the plaster is completely dry. It'll go a lot faster and it'll be a lot more easy to work with if you just take the time to wait. So what I use for my sandpaper is a fairly coarse grit. I use 80 grit sandpaper, and that'll just get it down pretty quickly. So fold it up and then just start sanding. And as you go, you'll find that the plaster dust clogs up the sandpaper pretty quickly and it'll make it pretty slow. So just flip over your sandpaper and continue going. Plaster is really soft, which is why it sands so quickly. It's one of the reasons I like working with it. That does mean that you don't actually wear the sandpaper out very much, so you can just rinse off your sandpaper once it's completely full of plaster dust, and then let it dry and start over again. For details, just fold your sandpaper up a little bit more so you've got an edge to work with, and then sand in the direction of the edge you've got. This is one of those cases where you don't really want to go back and forth if you want a very crisp edge. Try not to go over the edge itself, just sand the walls of your edge and you'll get it to a point. And then that's it, basically. I didn't show any painting because it's different for literally anything that you do, but just want to wipe down your piece, get all the plaster dust off before you start, and then do a thin coat of paint, kind of a watered down paint to give it a base coat. And then if you want to use spray painting, that works too, if you can find the right color, though I never can. And what that does is it seals the plaster, and then you can build the rest of the pigment up and the details and all that stuff. And that's it, you're done. Feel free to contact me about questions or commissions or anything like that. So I hope this helped. Good luck with your props. Bye!